Oh, shit. Alrighty. Okay, hit the wrong bloody button. There's the opening little clickety clacks and so forth and so on for the show. Too many screens, too many buttons, too many damn menus. Okay, and here we are at tortuganwordpress.com, Troubles in Paradise Project, Rulin' James Downard. You may or may not be hearing an occasional rumble. That's the space heater that I got as a gift to replace the one that had gone defunct. And now we've got the chance of actually keeping the room a little bit warmer during the winter time so that I don't have to keep the furnace up above 52 so I don't run out of fuel. Anyway, let's proceed in the exciting little world of Evolution Hour here. As you may know, if you have not been living in a cave these last weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, I am analyzing Contested Bones, the creationist book from Rupi and Sanford, who are attempting to dispute all of that natural human evolution stuff. And they finally got into the Homo habilis chapter, where, for those of you who are not entirely aware of it, Homo habilis is that little blob that's in between those now thicket of Australopithecines and then the arrival of Homo erectus, that is the human species that went boop all over the planet and got into Asia and a whole bunch of other places that hadn't been before, the out of Africa phase of things. Homo habilis is a still fragmentary blob of very, very limited fossils, and it's still classified as genus Homo, not genus Australopithecine. So there's been no shifts on that front. One of the arguments that's being made by Rupi and Sanford is that it's just a catch-all, and they're just a bunch of apes, and there's nothing unusual about them at all. Yeah, well, they were suppressing information on the Australopithecines. Now they're continuing to suppress the information on Homo habilis and others. Some of the papers, as you know, in the procedure that I've been doing here, as I find material, as I go through their sources, they don't have a bibliography, they don't have an index, so I'm constructing a framework to be able to analyze what all they're doing. And there's a consistent pattern in the book. They're running off of a little under half of their source citations are from technical literature. Most or a big chunk, almost half, are just authority quotes. Almost half of their technical citations, they're misrepresenting the content, as in suppressing information that conflicts with their model. This is not good. And they're relatively sparse. They're running at under 2 citations per page. So that's not a fabulously well-documented thing. But they are bumping into a lot of recent material. And to the extent that I could get full links to put in these videos so that everybody can follow up on it, I do that. But there's an awful lot of obscure papers that I have access to, but it's not commonly accessible. And so I'm not going to just put up an abstract. No, you got to be able to read the whole thing, because the whole essence of source methods is to see what they're leaving out. And to do that, you've got to read the whole paper. So there was one 2015 paper by Berger that's a really neat one, and it's technically on Homo naledi, which is a new genus of that early branching bunch. And they just happened to mention along the way Homo habilis, and Rupi and Sanford glommed off an authority quote from them about the one particular bone that has an ape-like, chimpanzee-like quality to it. If you read the whole article in context, you'll find out how, no, it's a bit more complicated than that, way more complicated than that. And by the way, they're going to be having a whole chapter in Contested Bones about Homo naledi, so I'm hoping that that article will be brought up again, and we'll deal with that in due course. I also put a link up to my own Planet of the Apes chapter from Tip. Because it's there, read it. I put this stuff up. I've done work on this, make use of it. But it also covers a lot of the history of the single species concept that was an obsession in the 19th and 20th centuries, the issue over which came first, big brain or bipedality. And in a lot of evolutionary contexts, you've got issues that are kind of fighting words for a while, and then they get more data and they go, yeah, okay, we were jumping to conclusions. The one issue had to do with relatively short Australopithecines, only 3 feet tall, and then more normal human-sized Homo erectus, and particularly in Africa, where apparently being tall and thin and having a low surface area was really handy. So sun beating down on you. Stockier Neanderthals live in a different environment later on. And so they were kind of assuming that the transitional stages would be about midway size, but that isn't what happened. And what we find out is Homo habilis and that bunch are just about as small as the Australopithecines. That's noted, I think, in the Berger article. The point here is that why would you expect there to be a nice, smooth transition going on? We now know that there is no single gene for height. That's, in fact, a whole slew of different variables that determine how tall you are. And so the idea that there would be some immediate operational change that would instantly change it, what seems to have an effect on height, certainly is diet. And just to look at the height of relatively short Japanese, and then they start eating a lot of meat post-war, and bingo, they start looking as tall as basketball players in the United States. So it's highly likely that some of the things that would be affecting the diet or the height structure of Homo erectus is diet, and that Homo habilis and the Australopithecines had a different diet structure. This is before cooking. This is about, there's a whole big debate in the paleoanthropology community to this day about the extent to which human evolution got jump-started because of the tendency to eat more meat and eventually cooking of meat. And that whole fire usage, which pops up more and more and more as you start finding out of things about 500,000 years ago or so, when you start finding first hearths and things like that, to where opportunistic fire use changes to, hey, we know how to start fires. And away we go. All of that, along with tool making and all the rest, are important issues that just get sidelighted in the creationist worldview. Because I'm all by myself here, I'll have to stop over periodically to see what we got going on in the live chat. And if anybody's got any questions or comments on there, I hope to be able to get to them. But I'm just by myself here, so nobody else is in the room, so I'll have to glance over periodically at the little side window. The tool use in particular is extremely relevant. And to this day, there's still some debate as to whether Homo habilis, tool-making man, handyman, was actually the builders of some of these tools. And there is ample opportunity to think that some of the advanced Australopithecines were doing it. So Homo habilis may or may not be a single species. There's still dispute about that. But the ones that have popped up are short, and they're still in the Australopithecine range. None of them, however, are classified as Australopithecines. Any attempt, if you look at the bone range and the femur details and all the little fiddly bits, which these technical articles go into in grisly detail, none of them are arguing significantly that no, Homo habilis is actually largely a variety of Australopithecine. So something interesting is going on in this period when the very first most primitive tools are showing up. There's increasing diversity amongst not only the Australopithecines, but now this Homo habilis and cousins, and eventually then Homo naledi and all these other ones that are popping up. I don't think any paleoanthropologist is today thinking that we have all the species in place and that we have all the data field. The old single species, this replaces this in a nice, neat escalator of progress that was the notions of 100 years ago, that's gone. No, we have shrubbery of diverging and competing lineages that can sometimes be niche sharing, and it becomes much more fun to try to figure out, much more interesting, frankly. Stephen Bauman says, I personally think we should put the Homo line with humans similar to us, like Heidelbergensis and Neanderthals. Well, technically speaking, they're all classified as the genus Homo, so they are. That's the whole point, is that we have our family branching off from the Australopithecines, and exactly the circumstances of that, you'd have to know more and more and more about things. We can see that Neanderthal end. There was, by the way, a really kick-butt show on PBS, a 2-part one. Andy Serkis was involved with it, if you've seen it, about recreating the Neanderthals. And there's been just the latest cutting-edge material about the thorax size and the stamina issues, that there was every reason to think that the Neanderthals were really good fast sprinters, but not necessarily long distance runners. And of course, they didn't have atlatls, the spear throwing, so they had to fight close up. They were very clever people and lasted for 500,000 years. That's way longer than we've been on the planet. But they're not our species, even though they were able to interbreed with us. And it was really superb in terms of their, they were talking about the Sahel, I think it's the place up in Turkey, or Iraq, somewhere around in there, where there have been quite a few Neanderthals. And although a lot of us tend to associate, and even me in my older version of it, you think of Neanderthals because they were initially found in the Neander Valley in Germany, the Neanderthal. That's what that word means. And that's why it can be spelled with a TH or a T. If you pronounce it without the A, you never pronounce the H. Those are silent in German. So it's always pronounced Neanderthal, independent of how you spell it. And it's because the Germans don't pronounce the TH sound. It's T. That's how they spell that T sound in German. So there's a little bit of linguistic fiddling. But for me, when I was growing up, you tended to associate them with Europe. But most of the range of Neanderthals is in Eurasia, not Europe. And in fact, it's in that bunch down in the Levant area in the Middle East that's where they're bumping into human beings. The first Homo sapiens that are coming out of Africa and having some boinking episodes going on occasionally. Under what circumstances, we don't know. Anyway, it was an excellent show. And if you have a chance to catch it, it was a two-parter or maybe shown in one blob on some things. It was entirely good. And I've forgotten the title of it. But Andy Serkis and a bunch of people who were good at that motion capture thing were trying to recreate in digital recreations the gesturing, the movements of things, and it was quite a deliciously done interdisciplinary thing. They had quite a few paleoanthropologists, about half a dozen of them or more, who were contributing the technical information on it. And a British paleoanthropologist lady was the host of it, and it was very, very nicely done. Well worth the watch. Anyway. Bij is asking, BJ, weren't they found in Israel and near as well? Yeah. There's, if you want to get biblical, you can say, you know, all these cute little interactions are happening in that same little zone where so many religions have popped up and people have gone up. But this, of course, is way earlier. This is tens of thousands of years ago. And so it's off the scope in terms of the Battle of Jericho or anything else that's occurring in more recent things. Yeah, the old scratches is almost like their genes came from their ancestors. Yeah, that's the interesting aspect about paleogenomics, because although it's exceedingly unlikely we'll have a hell of a lot of genetic information from even remnant erectus populations, we do have full DNA from the Neanderthal and the Denisovans. We've got really good DNA from them now. Svente Pebo, the guy with all the umlauts over his name, and their teams have done spectacular work in this area. And that allows us to fiddle out more about the genetics of things, and to where they'll be able to figure out more about why Neanderthals look different than we do and what genes did it, because we can retro-engineer in some respects some of these little components. And then you can apply that to the even more divergent morphology going back farther and farther back in time. So even though you don't have their DNA directly, you can see the effects of the DNA in the physical morphology and fiddle out what genes needed to have changed in order to produce that. Although it can get frisky, because you can have lots of different layers of things interacting. When they did the paleogenomic work on the bird beaks, there was a little bit of a flap because one of the genes was known to be involved in that beak formation, but they were tweaking a gene that hadn't been previously implicated. So there was another team that had already worked out two genes that were involved in bird beaks, and here Buller were tweaking the mutations in that one and a different one and reconstructing the dinosaur snout. Well, it's probably a lot like height, that you've got multiple genes going on in these things, and they're able to tease them out even more. Buller's paper I've cited a couple different times, and I lob it at people online when I talk about paleogenomics, because it's so interesting. It was in Journal Evolution, and it's open access, and it's one of the citations I have in Evolution Slam Dunk. If you don't have Evolution Slam Dunk, why not? It's my little opus magnus at the moment. There's way more than just the reptile-mammal transition in it, and you'll find a link to that in the video description, and you'll find it on my website, both to the ebooks and I sold 3 copies so far this month. That's good. I want to sell more. Old RJ can use the royalties, damn it. And it's a damn good book. I'm very, very proud of it. It covers, I wanted it so that if you know diddly squat about evolution issues and creationism coming into it, you'll know the main players, you'll know the spectacular reptile mammal case, you'll know tons about bird evolution, and there's stuff on insects and ants, and there's material on stupid creationists sticking their foot in their mouth again and again and again and again and again and evading data. So it's a rib tickler for funny in terms of oh boy, did they just write that? So I'm very, very proud of that. And we'll be doing the same kind of a thing with Jackson Wheaton, our new book, which should be out next year. If you hear a rumbling going on in the background, that's the space heater that Justin gave me. I wrote his name in as Jason. That's not right, Justin. A sweet local kid who is the reason why I have got my first camera, and he's helped with an awful lot of things, and he has helped me not freeze to death in the wintertime by loaning me a little space heater here, and particularly working on here in the den where I'm doing all my research and online stuff and these shows. It's all in this little room. You can see all my CDs and stuff that I don't want to hawk them. Not that anyone is really going to be anxious to buy CDs of Roth symphonies. I really seriously doubt there's a hell of a lot of money to be made out of that. But nevertheless, that's my world behind me. Let's see, we've got a bunch of side issues going on about Mohawk Indians and the apparently an Amerindian version of the Cretan paradox. Yeah. Anyway, so evolution slam dunk there. There's some of Buller's work in there. In fact, I mentioned quite a lot on paleogenomic stuff, the reconstruction of mammal teeth, the feather and developmental biology and that, and there's an awful lot of work on it, and it's a thing that you can lob at anti-evolutionists up the yin yang. I'll be getting to another one of my favorite bricks, the ALUs, a little bit later on in the show when we get into Fazal Rana. What I do on these programs is to, as I do research on tip, which I'm doing all the time, I'll come across some really juicy episodes of anti-evolutionist dumb. And so what I'll put them in, as I've been doing in the last few weeks, as the second half of the show, so that we can have discussions of things. Last week was a bunch of stuff on Kent Hovind, because I wanted to help Jackson Wheat, who is going to be debating Kent Hovind in another couple of days, this Thursday, that we wanted him to be as up to speed as possible. He is not a theatrical type. He's not a geeky little improver like me that's got theatrical experience, and therefore it's not he's not as naturally acclimated to that kind of a framework as I am. So I wanted him to be super duper prepared and to have a good amount of the information under his belt in terms of what Kent Hovind had said, so he can go after him with a source methods approach, and to be able to do it as smoothly and comfortably as possible, because nothing pleases me more than seeing other people flatten Kent Hovind as well as I did. I put my link in, by the way, to my debate with Kent Hovind, and that's pure source methods. I contend that since source methods is a game Tortukans cannot play, the more we force them to play that, the better we do, and the worse they do. So we got all of that. Jill looking over here for questions on things. Oh, Mohawk Indian blood Indians never die. Intelligent designer would use a similar genetic code for all life on Earth. You're not going to reinvent the wheel for anything that rolls. That's not necessarily true. I, in fact, had studied the variations in the genetic code. And this goes back to the issue is, why are the codons assigned to particular amino acids? Is that arbitrary, or is it in fact a natural phenomenon where they don't have an option? In other words, that there are affinities for particular amino acids in particular codon assignments, that this got cemented into the genome really, really early, and it's not arbitrary. This is not a trivial issue. If they are not arbitrary, then the intelligent designer has to explain why they're not arbitrary. Why now they're veering onto the natural evolution end, to where the codon assignments are a natural phenomenon. And the other issue is, were they always triplet codons, or whether there were duplexes to begin with? Because if you look at the most commonly used amino acids, they are the ones that are in the most redundant ones. And if you pull back the third codon assignment, which is what can get changed when codons get reassigned, you find out that you can code for all of those with only a duplex system rather than a triplex. So it's very possible that the early pre-life, way before Luca, didn't have a triplex system. The other issue is if you just do the numbers on if the assignments are not arbitrary and it's purely or not necessary, they're absolutely arbitrary. You can put any amino acid combination at all. There are enough codons available that you could give every species on Earth its own proprietary DNA code, because you would have enough opportunity with all those different permutations. And because the proteins would be constructed uniformly, the fact that they're coded for by an individual DNA system would be completely irrelevant. And whether or not, of course, you could theoretically have sexual reproduction that way or not, but that would be within a species or a kind. So theoretically, creationists could have umpteen different DNA codes available. And there's more than enough numbers to do them. I ran the math on it. It's just colossal if you do all the different permutations. Unless there's a biological reason why the codons are assigned the way they are. And that drags you right back to natural evolution and the fact that God can't tweak whether or not an ATU refers to a particular, an AGU refers to a particular assignment or not. We know that the mitochondria particularly have reassigned some of the things. And there's the things where start-stop codons, which will bring us into the ALU matter, which we'll be getting into shortly. That involves some of this start codon thing. Remember, all that you see at the DNA level is a pile of A, T, C's, and G's. And that when this is converted into RNA, they replace, I think, the C with the cysteine with a uracil. And why that's the case is still one of those cute little puzzlements. Why is there a difference between the two? Why does DNA use a slightly different set of nucleotides than the RNA, unless, more natural again, that's the only thing that can work? That's the only thing that comes about naturally, is that uracil has to occur in that context. It won't occur functionally in a DNA base, so you have a different kind of a thing. So all of those are delightful aspects. There's been a lot of mangling. I know Paul Nelson, who is a young Earth creationist but calls himself an intelligent designer, was one of the point people at the Discovery Institute. This has been 15, 20 years ago, prattling on about the codon assignments, that to say that because there are these variations in the mitochondria, that therefore the universal code is not universal and it must have been designed. So there's this temptation to want to see those variations that way. Problem is we can see how the original primordial coding system has gotten modified over time. And you can even see there are some amino acids being reassigned in some of these organisms, and you can see the flipping that's going on, where suddenly they start varying so they can do one or both. There's a little bit of work on that that's been done as well, which, by the way, doesn't get discussed by the anti-evolution movement. So don't bet your hopes on trying to get too far with the codon assignment issue, that it's looking really more and more evolutionary as you go along. We're just almost to the half-hour thing. Let me put up my obligatory thing about my happy supporters here. There we go. And we got a new patron today. So we'll add that into our modifying screen. Let me do my screen share here. The old fart is very slow on these things. I plead totally guilty. Okay, there's the infinite regress. There's the tip, patrons. And there's Stephen and Marigale and Keith and Dyer and Andrew and Eat Meal and Yui and Mona and Hendrel and Jen B and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Bo and Eric and Benjamin and Stagles and Alex and Sunsky Stone and Surus and Totus Real and Everett and Sir of Eyes Bloom, the new one just today, and Paul Williams. Thank you all. I will point out that the patreon.com is a bit more of a in principle rather than in reality, because they're slow as molasses for actually dribbling money to me. But everybody from your end who has put up scratch there, you get the reference here. You are acknowledged as a patron, whether or not I managed to get any of the money expeditiously. I've got a couple people who are involved in my novel project. Eat Meal has read the book. He loved foxing in the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. And Asurus is the one that is the reason why I've got the fancier camera and recording capability, because he's the one helping to help me do the audiobook of the Paralogs of Fog novel. Once we get that under our belt, which we should, I'm plowing ahead on the recording. We may very well get that out of the way before the end of the year. That means then I'll gear shift, and I'm going to do an audiobook version of the Slam Dunk. I'll have to do a lot of revamping because I can't be reading off technical citations, and I'd probably have to have a PDF available on the website that would list off the particular source citations that are in the book and find ways of alluding to them so people could download that and use that as a guide for the audiobook. Anyway, on the funding part, GoFundMe, I put the font bigger, www.gofundme.com, DCGo. There's a link to this in the video description for each show. That's the way to help in a hurry, in a way that Patreon does not. You don't get your name up on a cute little tip patron thing, but you can know that whatever you support to the project actually gets to me in a bloody hurry. So there's my shameless plug for the day. And we'll shut that down and we'll get rid of that. And get back to the happy show. Okay, what do we got going over here on... we can ask, a Mohawk sounds like he's in the live chat, is that he's pushing an anti-evolution position. Well, tell us your sources. Where are you getting all of this argument from? How did you fact check it? If you didn't fact check it, you should fact check it and try to work out what your model is, whatever it is. Try to explain the data. Don't just snark at matters, especially stuff that you've copied from anti-evolution literature. Try to account for the data. My favorite one is the reptile-mammal transition, of course, but another example is ALUs, which brings us to part 2, and that's Fazal Rana. This one I stumbled on a couple weeks ago when it was being brought up in an exchange. I think I actually was having it. It was either posted by Reason to Believe directly or by UROS. Anyway, it was about the argument of convergent evolution and the retrotransposons and these little short interspersed repetitive elements that are in the genome are supposedly designed rather than merely evolutionary convergence. And one of the examples that he brings up is the ALU, which he acknowledges that about 10 or 12% of us is ALU. There's over 1 million of the little beggars. There are retrotransposon that's got a copy me signal. Problem is that he just treats these convergence things as like happy face. But the problem is the ALUs are busy little beavers, and most of the ALUs that have become functional are doing bad stuff. Because the odds, if these things are just popping up at random, where this goes back to that codon assignment thing, there is a copy me signal in the retrotransposon. So the ALU is constantly duplicating itself in the genome. It's why it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I think the number of memory serves me is something like a couple hundred of them every generation, something like that. So they keep on growing. And they date way back into the primates, and we at some stage got these things, and it's been running amok ever since. There's a distant cousin to it that is a different letter, BABs or something like that, and I alluded to it in a Slam Dunk that pops up in mice. So these things can occur in a variety of different contexts, and once they're there, they can replicate. But they don't usually do anything because the ALUs don't have a README code. They don't have a transcript. They don't have a start code. Instead, it's got gibberish, and so the system just jumps past it and pays no attention and edits it out and overlooks it. Turns out, though, all you need is to change one nucleotide, and it goes from nothing to start, and that means that the system, which acts as a dull machine, hits one of these ALUs in the genome and transcribes it as though it's functional. Well, odds are it's going to be a screw-up. It's going to change the folding pattern of a protein. And so it pops up in a lot of diseases, a lot. of diseases. But once in a while, it can accidentally show up in a spot where it's actually helping. And it's happened in the brain. We have a bunch of little ALUs that do stuff up in our brains. And whether or not some of our advanced things is due to this weird little retrotransposon is another matter. And the example that were being brought up in the papers that I put the links up to. There was an older one from 1998 and another one from 2012, I think, and then one from 2015 or 2015 and 2016. Anyway, I put up the three things that were being linked to in the Rana article. And so you get to read the whole bloody things. They're all open access. And so I put links up to those so you can see what information is in there. They called attention to the fact that there's a deleterious side of ALU. And so the theodicy problem is, if ALUs are designed, then some of them were designed to be bad things. In fact, lots and lots of them were designed to be bad things. So, well, Rana is trying to use this as a discussion against junk DNA, as though that's the big issue. It's that, don't they do stuff that's not nice? And the reason why they do that is because they just suddenly get kicked on. And the reason why the ones that do good things do stuff is because they just got kicked on. So it's all part of a big bouillabaisse of issues about what the hell are all these damn ALUs doing in our system, running off like a little self-replicating ticking time bomb. Does he really want to argue that every one of them was intentionally designed? Or now are we going to play picky-choosy and say, well, they're there for no good reason. They're replicating because the designer wanted them there. If the designer wanted a particular ALU sequence to do something functional, why not just design that in specifically? Zot. And there we got it. Why have these little self-replicators busily doing their little shtick in the background? That's the problem that Rana just doesn't seem to want to think about. And nobody in the field wants to think about it. I mentioned ALUs and this concomitant mouse one in Slam Dunk because Jonathan Wells went after it. And it pops up because it's in relation to the whole notion of what it means to be a functional biological system that runs naturally versus a designed one. And if you're going to picky-choosy one little piece, you got to picky-choosy the whole thing and account for all of it. So let's see what we got going on there. Old Scratch says ALU is a short strand of DNA. I think it's like about 300 nucleotides, something like that. But it's got this copy me signal. So roughly now, 10 to 12% of us, you and me, are ALU. And so it's not a trivial detail. It's an amazing, in other words, there's more ALUs in our genome than there is Neanderthal DNA. There's a measurement by a factor of 5. So 2 to 5, depending upon the circumstance. Brian Stevens put up the Patreon. Remember, I'll put up the GoFundMe. That's better. If you really want to help the old RJ, that really is better, because that stuff gets to me in a way that the Patreon doesn't. You get, I hate to be a bite the hand that feeds, but nevertheless, I don't get the feeding part the one way. There's my GoFundMe page. And at the moment, I've got like about 187 people, and thank you, everyone. But that's a long way from crowd. I've got thousands of people following me on Twitter, and the people that follow me on Twitter have collectively tens of thousands, and so there's oodles of people out there. I'd love to see a chunk of people come forward in a group. Imagine if like 100 people who know each other said, hey, let's buy RJ a cup of coffee. I don't drink coffee, but it's the equivalent of it, $5 or $10, just once, boop, and do it all as a group. So a bunch of them do that. That's a ton of money. That's a chunk of funds. Or if you can do the sustaining thing, that's another bit. There's a handful of people, primarily local ones, who are sustainers. They put down $5 or $10 every single month. It's on a spot basis, but you can do it as a sustaining thing. If you can spare $60 in a year, that's $5 a month. If there would be 100 people or more who could do that, wow, I could buy ink regularly as well as eat. I'd be able to refuel the furnace. I'd be able to be certain that if there's some new anti-evolution book that I need to acquire in order to be able to respond, I'm not depending upon the gift of the book. I can actually just get it. And so I can get a little better and upgrade a bunch of things that need to be done. There it is. I'm on Social Security, and I get a little dribble of stuff from the book royalties, steady but not a stampede. That's another thing. If you think my books are worthwhile, tell people about them. Tell people higher up on the food chain. Let Neil deGrasse Tyson or Richard Dawkins or the FFRF or American Atheists or Center for Inquiry or any of those bunch saying, hey, there's this little geek down here operating out of his den that you maybe want to pay attention to. So there's my self-aggrandizing bit. But I can't do that myself. It's up to you to do it because you take me seriously and you think that I'm not an idiot and that I'm doing worthwhile work. I'll say that the TIP project is a unique project that I began, which is that I am documenting the full range of anti-evolution source usage. No one's ever done this before. Nobody, as far as I know. And I was in a position to do it because I had accumulated such a gigantic data field that now I could just add a couple columns and start tracking other issues. And then I could target what was being discussed and what doesn't. And that's why I wrote Slam Dunk, because I could figure out, wait a minute, here's a spectacular science data field that wasn't properly covered. It was only occasionally mentioned in the pro-evolution science stuff. It's an obscure area. There's a bunch of mammal paleontologists, and they do wonderful work, and they do books and all that, but it's not commonly known. It's not like dinosaurs that are like the fancy, ooh, those are the stars. They have documentaries and cartoons made about them. When have you seen a therapsid as the star of a animated cartoon? No. So it was a relatively under-mentioned thing and was avoided almost exclusively by the anti-evolutionists. And the few examples of when anti-evolutionists bumped into it, boy, did they blow their feet off. So I felt that that was needed to be done. So let's see what else is going on here. We've still got a thing back and forth. Oh, good gravy. Mohawk Indians is bringing up Hitler now. Oh, no, 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 no. Let's not go into that side. Yeah, I seem to think I'm going to look geeky here for a moment because I'm looking on my, I have my spreadsheet still up. Normally, I shut everything down in order to keep my data field as easy as possible, but I believe I've seen him mention stuff before. Let me see what I got on him in my spreadsheet. I keep a track of all of this stuff. I've got thousands and thousands that I've kept track of in just a short. Yes, Mohawk Indians, Blood Indians Never Lie, that he was a commentator on one of the previous shows. Origins are bust and fossils no babies. That's been his argument so far. Fossils, you can't tell whether they've had babies. That's a Kent Hovind style line. That's just flapdoodle. Because sometimes actually you can tell that they have babies because they drop dead in the middle of childbirth. There's an ichthyosaur that did that. But with 100% certainty, I can tell you every single vertebrate in the entire fossil record had parents. And if you look at what a particular fossil would need to look like in order to have had babies, either by being a male and breeding or a female, that the ones that did have babies are going to look like the ones you actually find in the fossil record. So, Puffalophicus asks, can you send me a link on Twitter or Facebook if I wanted to discuss the after show you were on this weekend? Ooh, I didn't keep track of it. You could check with Steve McRae, though, that after show. He would have the link for it. I didn't mark down the particular linkage on it, but you can Twitter Steve McRae and he'll have the little blurb on it. If he doesn't, you can go fie upon you. Anyway, yeah, that was an interesting discussion where I ran into some photorists. It was a strange experience. There are some atheists who are Tortukans, and they're just as intractable as any creationist on their particular hobby horses. And so when you approach it from a methodological direction, I get to annoy lots of people on all sides of the fence, because I say, excuse me, you may believe what you wish, but you got to explain the data field. That's the object of any hypothesis, is to explain the data. And so you want to discuss it with you. I meant a link to the Google Hangouts. Oh, Oh gosh, yes. Yipes. Well, I will throw caution to the wind here, and I'll just put it in the feed here, and you may come in on the field, and anybody who else does, remember, it's my room. I can eject you. So I'll do that. There's the Google Hangout, because I'm not on Twitter. I shut that down. And Brian is pointing out that Mohawk is making straw man statements, and that's not at all uncommon. Those of you who follow me on Twitter will know how often there are people who have these pros. One of the ones I really love, and that's why I keep track of what they say, is that, well, I discussed that before. I've already addressed that issue. And I go, want to bet? And the reason why I focus on a few handful of litmus test items is that I know I'll remember if you discuss this, and I can easily take note of it. So the reptile mammal transition is my go-to. ALUs are common. I call attention to those. I love mentioning the tooth enamel genes, because we know that all toothless mammals, including baleen whales, have tooth enamel genes in them. They've been pseudogenized in some cases, or just lying around disconnected and still largely functional but not being used. And you wonder why a designer would be so harebrained as to do that. I use the example of it'd be like a designer of a Tesla putting a gas tank on it. Others have suggested it would be like having a car, a gasoline engine car with a bale of hay in the trunk to feed the horse. It doesn't make sense from a design point of view. And we find an awful lot of those things going on, and ALUs are an example of them, and tooth enamel genes are another, and these things that seem odd if you were doing it from a design standpoint. The reptile mammal jaw transition is yet another one where we can see, why do we start out developmentally like a reptile, which we do, and then it shifts along to form the mammal arrangement. And then the excess bones that we can see being marginalized in the fossils turn into usage for the middle ear. And we even have fossils with cartilage still attached, showing that they're still partially functional in the ancient transitional forms. It's just spectacular sequence of stuff, which no anti-evolutionist ever discusses. Hello, Puffalophagus.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, indeed I can. So you wanted to have a chit-chat about chit-chatting.
Yeah, because this is what okay, so I was watching your stream, the after show, right? Where they were discussing they try to like gangplank you with the gentleman's argument in his book
Photo.
for intelligent design, right? And it was like every time you tackled the specific space they were trying to carve out for the intelligent designer, they immediately sought a new space to carve out for the intelligent designer. And I'm like, wait a second, do they realize what they're doing here? Because right now they can just tell Ken Hovind to sit down, Ken Ham to sit down. They can even tell Dr. Gish, go ahead and sit down because I've got this for you.
They were just as intractable as any of those creationists, and they were atheists.
And you were like, and your thing was, oh, how they were saying, well, how can you say this? And you're like, well, clearly the heart existed before the ear did. So if God's plan was to make the predator able to hear the increase,
God's plan. I'm not sure what it is they think is going on, because they were not defending a creationist position.
Right. And sometimes what I'm saying is whatever they're inputting as the intelligent designer. Right.
Yeah. To be a brief summary, for those of you who don't know, Fodor, and I've forgotten his first name, is an older philosopher. And he had written a book with, I think, Palmy and Terry. I've got it in my tip bibliography. And they've been kind of darlings of some aspects of anti-evolutionism. I've seen intelligent designers waft Fodor in front of me. Fodor's position was, and still is, that he's got the slam dunk refutation of natural selection as a meaningless tautology, because he did an argument with this glub example that if you add his image was that there would be an animal that had an exceptionally noticeable heart thump. That is it being selected for because it's pumping blood, or is it being selected for or against because an animal can hear it and come in and eat it?
Well,
and you can't, in principle, separate those selection things. And I go, yes, you can.
yeah, and then you were like, what I'm saying is they were like, you can't test for this, and you're like, well, there's a way you can test for this, and then they were like, well, natural selection doesn't account for that, and I was like, wait a second, natural selection is not a thing.
Yeah, it's the outcome of a comparative process acting upon individual organisms within a population.
I was gonna ask you, but this is my interpretation of what natural selection is. Natural selection is the current set of conditions a particular organism is living in.
Yeah, and this.
So once you change the conditions, you change.
To be fair to the full, this has been a problem that snagged up a lot of people. You may not be aware that Alfred Wallace and Darwin got into knockdown, drag-out literary things. They weren't doing it physically, but they were shooting commentaries back and forth, letters and that sort of stuff. About the role of natural selection. Was it the same as artificial selection? For Darwin, they were identical. That natural selection functions exactly like an artificial selection mechanism, except there's no intellect involved. It's just natural.
There's not any one person picking the variable.
Wallace didn't like that. Wallace distinctly separated in his own brain artificial selection from natural selection. He also didn't like sexual selection. And that's one where Darwin was right and Wallace was wrong, because sexual selection does, in fact, that got from the 70s on, they rediscovered that. That one of the things that pissed me off a little bit about Steve McRae's discussion in the actual debate context was that he was dissing Darwin in a very tactical way. Jackson Wheat knew what he was talking about, and I knew what he was talking about. It's that Darwinism, if you mean Darwinism at the variation level, Darwin got it wrong, but everybody got it wrong. They didn't know how inheritance worked. And he came up with a cockamamie idea called gemules that would be a blended inheritance thing. And it was completely based upon just speculation, because nobody knew anything about DNA. Nobody knew about genes yet. The word hadn't even appeared.
Right. I was going to say, if we didn't know about recessive and dominant genes, like that would be considered like a pretty good best guess, right?
Well, they were stumbling around, and everybody thought of blended inheritance, including Darwin. It turns out it was particulate, which, ironically, it was hard to work out how a blended inheritance way of inheritance could make natural selection work well. And we now know later on with neo-Darwinism, it should have been a dead giveaway that it's called neo-Darwinism for a reason, because it's still Darwinism. And Darwinism is that there's inherited variation by whatever means, that natural selection is the dominant thing acting upon it. What neo-Darwinism did was, we now know how the genes work, kind of, sort of. And so we're now explaining how Darwinism functions with the new genetics. That's why it's neo-Darwinism. It's not called neo-not-Darwinism. So the idea that there's nobody around today who's a Darwinist, excuse me, I read, the word pops up all the time. And Richard Dawkins would be a classic example of, yes, we are Darwinists, and here's why.
Yeah, and see, that's my thing, is that this is the thing you got to understand, is that Steve is a philosopher, first of all. So he takes a philosopher's argument. Like, he still gives Psi 10 Bruggencate as much rope as he wants, because...
Oh, and boy, I ran into him. I don't know if you saw the exchange I had with Psi.
No, but I'm just going to guess that
it was not pleasant.
Can I take a guess that at some point... Can I guess that at some point in time during your discussion, brain in a vat was brought up?
Oh, no, we didn't get that far. We never even got that far. No, he was talking about what is true. Define what's true.
Yeah, and how do you know that that's true?
I gave my functional definition for it, and that didn't please Psi. And Steve basically was siding with Psi that I supposedly didn't answer the thing. So we bogged down in a half an hour of wheel spinning nothing to where I was then bumped off of the thing because there was a wheel spinning thing where they switch the thing to the next show. And so I was bye-bye. No, that was a complete waste of time all the way around. It was a presuppositional thing.
Because my thing is this, right? It comes down to his argument is always, how do you know? How can you know that your knowledge, your mental faculties, or this knowledge you have is correct? The same freaking way that you know in your heart of hearts, and actually a better way than you know in your heart of hearts that the Bible is true or whatever, because you only have yourself and witness testimony to go on.
Yeah.
What I'm going on is something that can be tested in a myriad of ways by anybody, and I have to accept the results as long as they follow all these different steps. You know, I have to accept those results, right? But if I follow all the steps of what it is to, you know, have a divine inspiration, right? And I say my divine inspiration is exactly opposite of what his divine inspiration was. Who's right?
Yeah, one of the pieces that I put up on my website is a lecture that I gave on non-overlapping magisterium revisited, and please, I hope people will take a look at that, because I go into the whole issue of what absolute truths are, and does an atheist have to shy away from them, and how do you deal with them? And my argument, are you familiar with Gould's Noma argument?
No, but I'm always willing to add to my
here's
repertoire.
more of the history lesson, because it does still pop up. Stephen Jay Gould, in a book, Rock of Ages, back in 1999, so it's almost 20 years ago, argue that they were non-overlapping magisteria. He was fancy words. He always loved fancy words and semicolons, between science, which deals with one side, and then religion, which deals with the ethics and morality stuff. And these were non-overlapping magisteria. Well, I said, and this has gotten hit upon by both sides. The religionists don't like it because it implies that science has all the verifiable stuff, and religion is this thing over in the corner that deals with just the squishy things like morality is not important. How strange. But the scientist chimes, and Jerry Coyne still dumps on it constantly, it's that it's giving the religionist credit for any legitimacy whatsoever, and he doesn't like that, even though it turns out Coyne's position is indistinguishable from mine, in that I pointed out that Gould draw the line in the wrong spot, that it's not between religion and science, it's between decidable propositions and undecidable propositions. And those are where you have the dividing line. Science deals with the decidable propositions, and philosophy deals with the undecidable one. Now, here's where it gets fun, is it's a quadrant, because all propositions are either decidable or undecidable, meaningful ones, and they are either true or false. So I don't give up the idea of an objective true. I just say that you can't decide objective truths over on the undecidable side. Morality and ethics, they're all presuppositional. Whereas over in the science side, I like Neil deGrasse Tyson's phrase where he says, science is the thing that deals with stuff that's true, regardless of whether you want to think it's true or not. and you can decide that. You can actually work it out. We don't have to guess that the earth is not flat. We can know. So knowledge is what you have over on the decidable side. You have belief on the undecidable side, but it doesn't mean that the beliefs are necessarily squishy or true or not true, but the method you use to determine them. I'm very much a William James style pragmatist, and in some respects so is Steve McRae and a lot of other people. It's that what you can do, are you familiar with William James?
No.
More people you need. William James is gobsmackingly brilliant. He's the guy that founded psychology as a discipline. He was fabulously a polymath, and he was doing a lot of his stuff from about in his youth, in the 1870s, all the way into the 20th century. And his books, if you can read any of his material, he thought about so damn much, and was so insightful. And one of his notions is pragmatism, that you don't have to necessarily know about how true or false something is, but you can look at its consequences. And if it's got good or bad consequences, then you can measure whether you should believe it or not. So you have to look at the consequences of stuff. And I'm very much a pragmatist in that respect.
Well, because you brought up morality, right? And so what theists like to say is that morality, right? Everybody goes back to the golden rule, right? And they say, oh, well, the golden rule came from our God. But I think it was Brian Stevens. It might be Dynacat, so I don't want to leave him out. But I think it was Brian Stevens that shared a piece, and it linked me to some shit on Facebook or whatever. Excuse my language. And
I say shit all the time, no problem.
But what it was is it was some actual scientists talking about actual data that had been gleaned from the world, and what they said is that when they go to indigenous tribes that have never heard of the Abrahamic religions, they don't even know that there's anything outside of their continent, basically their area they live. They all operate on the golden principle, which is if we
others the way you want to be treated.
Well, no, like kind of sort of like this, right? So like, which is what they call the prisoner's dilemma, right? Which is, do I interact with this person, right? And it's based on one single criteria, which is if I interact
that would be a
with
different prisoner's dilemma is specifically about cooperation in the face of you making a decision that if you cooperate or not, you can be screwed, but you could theoretically betray the others. That's actually
that's the prisoner's dilemma, right? But what they were saying was that the standard. Right, and that's what they're saying is that how people interact with each other. So what they were saying is that even in these tribes, they employ a system of if I do business.
Let me interrupt you briefly. I want to dump on Mohawk in the live chat. Mohawk, let me quote you. Before I go, I just want to say this: 500 years ago, they thought drilling a hole in your head would help headaches. 60 years ago, they thought a frontal lobotomy and electronic shock therapy was good. He repeats that mantra constantly. Excuse me, but that's bad science. It doesn't make your creationism true if we can ever figure out what it is you actually think. Account for the reptile-mammal transition, Mohawk. Explain some data. Don't keep trotting out these side examples. Explain the data. You tell me why a designer went out of their way to make probanognathids and account for that data field, and I'll be impressed, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. Okay, now back across to our side discussion on here.
Okay, so what they're saying is that they employ the if I do business with you and I gotta which is basically they're saying psychology works like this. If I'm gonna do a deal with you, if I know I'm never gonna see you again, it's in my best interest to cheat you as much as possible, right? But if I'm going to have to see you again, if I'm going to have to interact with you, deal with you again, it's my best interest to play fair, right? And to do fairly because, like you said, I want you to do fairly back to me.
Yeah, and
right?
we got a fascinating thing about this.
And so what they did is they said that exists in any human culture, even ones that are never ever heard of
beyond just human culture.
And then what they said was they tested it, and they said you can test it in vampire bats. They said because vampire bats, the female vampire bat doesn't actually eat the blood. What they do is they take in blood into these throat sacs and they fill those up. Then they take those back to the nest and they disgorge and they feed all the babies, right? No matter if it's theirs or anybody else's, they feed all the babies they can, right? And so they said what you can do is you can snatch up one of these bats, right, when it leaves the cave. Take a needle and fill these throat sacs up with air and then throw it back into the cave and it'll think it's time to land. Well, when it goes to land, it'll have these big swollen throat sacs and all these other bats will be looking at it like, look at how much blood she got, right? And then it won't feed any babies because it knows it doesn't have any blood in there, right? And they will all be like, well, what? It's got all that food, it's not sharing it. And then when it goes out and feeds again and it comes back, that time they will not feed its young.
Yeah, what you've actually got here are two parallel layers. The golden rule is a very specific one. It's basically the idea of fairness and reciprocity. And anybody that knows a dog will know dogs understand this.
Yes.
That they can tell the difference between how you treat that dog and how you treat the other dog, and they're going to pay attention to that. This is something that is cross-cultural and cross-species, as it turns out. You have to go way down into vertebrates to find an animal that can't tell when it's not being treated fairly. And though this is something that's basically a hallmark of intelligence. Now, the issue you're dealing with this other matter, the prisoner's dilemma, and this has to do with multiple layers about reciprocity issues. And there's a wonderful book called Super Cooperators that, oh gosh, I can never remember his name because there's too many scientists with the same name. But anyway, it's on the whole bit of how cooperation and competition works in real societies and real organisms. Now, direct reciprocity is you scratch my fin, I'll scratch yours. This turns out to occur way down through life. Yeast function under these same things. And what you have is a dynamic between the cheaters and the cooperators, and it builds up a dynamic structure that oscillates and finally achieves a mean. So organisms, regardless of whether they have a brain stem or not, end up with about the same degree of cheaters and cooperators, because that's the only way that it'll function without them falling apart. We complicate matters because we add a new layer that goes from indirect reciprocity, direct reciprocity to indirect reciprocity, because we have language. So now we have reputations, and we can talk about other people's reciprocity in addition to experiencing it directly. So then I can go, I'll scratch your fin because you'll spread the word that I'm a fin scratcher, and I'll get a benefit from somebody else that knows I have a reputation for being a fin scratcher. So now that's a radically more complicated thing, and it requires language. And because we are the ones, theoretically, if this is a model that's correct, it will be true for any organism that has a complex language that can pass on information that way. We can't tell that so much with cetaceans because we don't know what the hell they're saying to each other, because their language systems are so deeply divergent from the way we construct ours that we can't communicate effectively. But I would guesstimate that that would apply to cetaceans if they have a complex grammatical language in the same way we do.
Well, so actually, that is they actually did prove with at least one pod of orcas that that is the case, because it was basically there was, I guess they mate for life, or they pair or whatever. They have preferred pairs, but the one of the males had mated. His partner gave birth to one offspring, and I think one right after that, and then ended up dying. Well, something happened. He got basically shunned from the pack and pushed out because he was a competing single male now. And so he left, but his kids went with him because nobody else would take care of his kids. So he learned how to beach himself to snatch not only seals, but turtles and stuff like that off the beach. And he taught his kids how to do that. Well, in isolation from the pack, because he couldn't go back, he died. Well, the two youngins went back to the pack, and they had not seen the pack come and practice this behavior before until they all showed up together at seal season and just started wrecking the beach. And so they figured the only way that they could know this is if, basically, like you said, it was spoken word taught to them.
Oh, let me interrupt. I want to dump on Mohawk again.
Okay.
Mohawk says, brain, we are not apes. Apes are disgusting creatures who throw their doing at people. I think he means to say dung.
Has he been locked up?
Yeah, primates actually do throw poo and so forth, but we still throw poo. The president of the United States throws metaphorical poo all the time on Twitter. He doesn't.
Excuse me, James. Refined. James, I have been in a few correctional institutions in my life.
They throw poo too.
They throw poo as like the man that cannot fight will throw feces at you.
Yeah. So Mohawk, you are incorrect. And by the way, I'm asking you, what science sources have you ever bothered to deal with on here? I know because I measure this in my TIP project. I can tell you that anti-evolutionists pay almost no attention to the cognitive neuroscience issues. All that stuff about what animals do and what's going on in their brains and what goes on in our brains when we do moral reasoning, when we do all sorts of stuff. There's a huge technical literature on that front, and almost none of it is even alluded to, let alone discussed in the anti-evolution literature. I don't have to guess at it. I'm measuring it.
And now, just to do this, just to throw this in Mohawk's face, but also to pick your brain and to give the people in the chat a reason to go ahead and check out that GoFundMe link. Maybe you could expound for me on, there was a king that had done an experiment to find out the original language. And so he had two twins taken from their parent and basically put in isolation for like 18 years. And they were, it was way back in the, it was back in the.
I'm actually not aware of that one. That's neat. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. And what he did is he put them in isolation, and they basically grew up with no language taught to them, no nothing, and they developed no language.
Yeah, there is a window. We know, I will say this, we do know from a lot of research
And
that
they
there is a
said that
narrow
also because
window in which if you do not learn language from your parents, you never will. That there's a formative stage, and it's around in that 5, 6, 7-year-old stage. That's also the best time to learn multiple languages. It was a pain for me to learn a second language as an adult or as a college level area because
oh
I had never
yes, I
taken
know.
other ones. Whereas kids can soak this up like mad. We're in that stage. There's an awful lot of things that operated within window structures. The one thing that's intriguing to me, and I study this because it's related to the creation evolution issue. Young Earth creationists pay attention to it differently than non-young Earth creationists. Young Earth creationists have Tower of Babel. They have to have all human languages diverging from a node when God's confused the languages at Babel. Well, although you can produce family trees that are relatively tidy for Indo-European languages, which, by the way, would predate anything happening at Babel, you have to realize that there's more languages than just Indo-European. And so the interesting thing is, what was the language? What language was being spoken by the first human beings? It's not probably going to be Indo-European, and it's not going to be anything necessarily quite the structured that you find in any other language, but we can look at some likely circumstances. Languages tend to be inflected. The language you and I are speaking today, English, is not an inflected language. It's a mutant language. It only originated in the form we do relatively recently, in the time just before Shakespeare, between about 1200 and by 1700 or so, it was already flexed in place to where we can understand Shakespeare. His vocabulary is flowery, but we can understand it. You can't understand Beowulf. You can't.
No.
Chaucer is so still Germanic that it is an inflected language. And what's interesting is it's only been in recent times. There was a very excellent series that was done on PBS, and there's a book version of it, The Story of Language, that began to trace out why that happened and how it happened. And it turns out it had to do with the increasing interbreeding between Anglo-Saxons and Norse. And they had very similar Germanic languages that had very similar grammatical form, but the inflections were different. And so if you wanted to tell whether or not, are you buying a horse? Ein Pferde? Eine Pferden? Zwei Pferden? Having one, two horses? Did you just buy one horse or two? That eventually they just dropped the inflection system. So it's one horse, two horses, five horses. Okay, we got this straight. And it turned into this complex word order language that mutated in rapid ways very, very swiftly and turned into the language that we're all using today. It's I understand Chinese is another non-inflected language. It has a different structure, but it has highly specified tonal rules. You have to. There's no variation on how words are pronounced. You have to say exactly the right thing.
Right.
So yeah,
but it's much more
things.
complicated. And see, but theirs operates much like our English does as well. In that there you have Mandarin Chinese that is spoken throughout the entire country, but you also have a local dialect that is only spoken in your area. And if you spoke to someone else in that exact way, they would pretty much not understand you.
Yeah, English is intriguing because it is one feature that every other language is horrified at. It has a gigantic dictionary. It's got a vocabulary that just blows everybody away. And the fact that it throws everybody off, the old I before E, except after C, and all of that, it's because we have stolen words from umpteen different languages. We're the word thieves of all time. There's nobody that is as relentless as stealing words because we are a non-inflected language. We can take any word and plug it into our language effortlessly because we don't care where it came from.
Do you know how many people in their life have RSVP'd and cannot tell you what it stands for?
Yeah. My favorite was one when I was learning in German. In English, we have a phrase, armistice talks. And it's real easy. We've stolen the word armistice from the French and then use our word talks. Very easy. The Germans were obsessive. They came up with, let me see if I remember it correctly. It's Waffenstillstand Verhandlungen. which is weapons laydown discussion about.
What the fuck?
Yeah, isn't that weird? And so we're by nature word thieves, and it's made us very, very different. There is a body of cognitive theorists who are starting now to pay attention to the fact that because languages can be structured so differently, that the people who speak those different languages have to think a little differently. And I know directly from the German English example that what is it, the fact that the Germans have a totally different verb structure from English. So we would say, oh, I have to go to the store. I should have gone to the store. You'll notice that we cluster all of our verbs in one blob, and then we stick a direct object at the end of it. I should have done going to the store. The store is the thing that pops up at the end of it. Whereas in German, it is, I should to the store gone have. So you have this dangling verb, and then your objects and adjectives, and then you find out what happened at the end.
Yeah, because
different way of thinking.
That reminds me of the first time when I had to ask, like, because like the internet was not as good when I was a kid as it was now, right? I'm 31 years old, so I'm 31. So when I was a little kid, the internet was there. It was there, and we had AOL.
When I was a kid, television was new.
Okay, well, I'm I can't compete, but so like I worked at a bakery, and I had asked this Austrian lady. I was like, "What does Nürburgring Nordschleife mean? Nordschleife mean?" And she was like, "It means the ring on the hill, right?" And I was like, okay, this makes no fucking sense for a racetrack. Like, this doesn't make, like, Watkins Glen, and we have these like really sexy names that we come up with, right? And I'm like, this doesn't make sense. And she's like, is that Austrian or German? I was like, oh, it's in Germany. She's like, exactly why it doesn't make sense. It's just
and there would be dialects that Berliners would speak with a different dialect than somebody in Austria. And we forget how incredibly parochial languages have been up until the modern era. That England has umpteen different little dialects. And even to this day, you still find a social stratification because Cornwall and Lancashire and Scotland and all these other places that we would think of as trivial real estate differences. I mean, all of England's barely bigger than Idaho. And yet, it's got umpteen little fractured languages. Even in the United States, we are starting to see an increasingly homogenized form. And I remember back, I don't know if you ever remember the old Tonight Show host, Jack Parr. That's probably way before your time. He was the one that was before Johnny Carson. So that dates me. He once sat up, because I would sit up late and watch a Tonight Show late for a school kid. But it was live from the East Coast, so it was earlier on the West Coast. So it was like 10 o'clock or so here. And because I always had my homework done and so forth, we'd sit up and watch the Tonight Show. And he at one point said that the best English, the most correct English is spoken in the state of Washington. And because we were in Washington, we go, yeah, there we go. But in many respects, we're speaking a generic, homogenized, slightly flattened dialect form that's instantly intelligible to everybody. Whereas a lot of the regional dialects are ones that they have twists to them that they can understand us easier than we can understand them. So it's like a nesting process that's gone on. And then language continues to change. The vocabulary changes, word forms change. There's ones that I know that just have a conniption fit when they find out that people are saying, I want to, let's ask me. They use instead of ask. It's an easy thing for the tongue to flip.
Right, but that used to be said in English, in American English. It used to be said
before. It's not unique to Black language. It's just a new iteration of it. Because if you think of what your tongue has to do between ask and ax, the flip can easily happen, and it's happened before. And words they mutate. You know the word humongous, right?
Yeah.
I remember when it was new.
What?
It didn't exist until the mid-1970s. And nobody knows where it came from.
What?
Nobody. Oh, yeah. It was, I remember in the mid-1970s, I started hearing people say humongous. And it was a really odd word. And but it was a useful word. You know, there was a rat down in the basement. Oh, was it a big rat? No, it was a humongous rat. And there is no etymology to it. It's an invented word. Somebody had to invent that word out of thin air because it has no etymology. And then people like using it, and they used it to show you how fast this took place. I was first hearing it in the mid-1970s. By the mid-1980s, it was being used as a standard word in Scientific American.
That's like the word nerd. The word nerd was invented, I think, in the 20s.
Could very well be. And BJ says, yes, she had suddenly appeared and everyone loved it. That we can remember when a word appears, boop, out of the middle of nowhere. And there's like, a lot of words.
I used to think that mind your P's and Q's was mind your manners, right? Because that's the way people use it. And I was like,
quarts, I've heard.
Yes, it's mind your pints and quarts.
Which may or may not be true.
From the days of the general store when you lived like out on a piece of land.
These things are folk entomology. That human beings can't stand the idea that a word was just made up out of thin air. So they have to come up with an etymology for it no matter what. Okay is one that we have no clue where it originated. Abracadabra is one that they have kind of ideas. There are a bunch of words like that. And P's and Q's, that may be a true story, or it may be a etymology.
Abracadabra is slightly like because I thought this didn't have an origin either, but I work with some Muslim guys. One guy from Iraq and
mathematics and an Arabic term and so forth.
Yeah. When I said abracadabra, he was like he was like, "What'd you say?" I said abracadabra. It's what the magician says when something comes out. He was like, "Oh," he's like, "That's kind of like it's a slightly like an Arabic word that means to make appear, make it show."
Yeah. See, I know. Well, the other one that I really love about how things vary is I collected playing cards and largely tarots because they were hot in the occult movement, and I was fascinated by the game involved. I even wrote a tarot game into my Phileas Fogg novel, which amused Eat Meal no end. But anyway. If you're familiar, if you go into an average Barnes & Noble and look in their tarot section, and they got a bunch of little tarot decks, and you look up the Emperor card, regardless of who has designed it, odds are that there's going to be a guy sitting on a throne, and there's going to be little ram's horns on the edge of the throne. That's a standard weight deck that was designed in 1910. Why is there a ram's horn on the Emperor's throne in the tarot deck? Because they assigned the Kabbalah letters, which have astrological associations, to the various cards, and the Emperor card number 4 associated with Aries the Ram. Ta-da! So they just designed the card to fit. Now, where did Aries the Ram come from? That turned out to be a mistranslation. It was a mistranslation of the plow in old Babylonian astrology, and the word sounded a lot like what the word is for a ram in Greek. So it got mistranslated as Aries the Ram. So if they wanted to be accurate to the pseudoscience, they should have put little plows on the edge of the instead of a ram. Oh my
goodness. Oh man.
Yeah, that's how languages work. That's how people copy and like the born of a virgin thing, Alma versus Almas. Another one is it's easier for a rich man to enter heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. That's probably another mistranslation, because I think the word for a hawser, the thick rope that you use in a ship, is kamalos. And camelos, or one or the other, is a camel. And somebody mistranslated. The original probably was it was easier for a rich man to get into heaven than to put a thick rope through the eye of a needle. That makes sense.
I was going to say, because putting a even string through the eye of a needle is a son of a gun. So, I mean, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. That makes it sound like a rich guy is going to get into heaven better than anybody.
Yeah. Another fascinating thing
that's terrible. RJ, you have to edit that part out of this video, because if the Republicans find this part of the video, then it's done. I swear, I found a video where you made your prediction, your presidential prediction was going to happen with this administration, right? A year ago. Did you know that 9 out of 10 things you predicted came true?
Nothing surprises me about the Trump administration at all. And even the fact that the stock market stalled, and that we've got temporarily some fairly good times. Hell, you throw $1 trillion tax cut into the economy and a 20% corporate income tax. Well, duh, it's going to have some effects. It's a stimulus package. Oh, I put a thing up on Twitter, in fact, that I said, hey, now that the Democrats have taken over Congress, here, let's do this. Let's put through that 10% middle-class tax cut, okay, that you promised. And instead, we're going to also put through a couple $2 trillion long-term infrastructure program, and we'll pay for it by raising the top rate back up from 37% up to where it was during Ronald Reagan at 40%. Let's try that one.
I have a question. The president can basically ask the Fed to create a temporary tax holiday, right?
No. I don't think so. In fact, the president can't ask the Fed to do anything. The Fed is totally independent of all administration. They're separate from Congress, and they're separate from the president. And in fact, any president who even tries to grump at the Federal Reserve gets people antsy because they're totally independent.
Okay, because it seemed to me like the Fed, because the Fed, they changed the interest rate when basically every time Obama asked him to, he was like, this would be great if the Federal Reserve.
It may have looked that way, but no. And you have to remember why they were doing all of that. Here's another.
Because but my other thing is, if it's not that they're getting they're doing it by request. They got to just be like all policy wonks.
Oh, they are. Oh, boy, you haven't met a policy wonk until you see somebody on the Federal Reserve Board. But the reason why they're so fuss-potty about all of this stuff and why there was a desire to eventually raise interest rates again, because if you have interest rates dead low, capitalism is kind of scarfed on it because it's the whole point. The bank needs to have something pegged to that higher rate, and so you get more money that way, so bonds are more attractive. There's economic impact of it. The reason why they are panicky about all this stuff is something you've never experienced, and that's called inflation. You've never experienced an inflationary spiral, have you?
Oh, what are you talking about? I have. You gotta understand. I was a child of the late '80s, so when I grew up,
you came too late. You came too late. No, that was after they stopped the inflationary spiral. This was the thing that sank both the Bush the Ford administration and even Carter, and this goes way back to Richard Nixon, idiot. Who, in addition to doing stuff like subverting the Constitution, also did one of the dumbest things you could ever imagine doing, which is he decided to put in wage and price controls in the 1970s to stop what he thought was a worrisome inflation rate of 4%. And it turned 4% inflation rate into 12% inflation rate. And it got stuck. And so we had an inflation rate of 10, 12, 13% year after year after year. You've never experienced an inflation rate that high. People were reaching the point in the 1970s when you would go out and you would buy the new car, or you would buy the new refrigerator, or you would buy the new stuff because it was going to be significantly more expensive if you waited. And that had a weird economic effect. So when Reagan came in, he and Volcker at the Federal Reserve independently decided to bite the bullet, which means that you had to squeeze inflation out of the system. This was called stagflation because it was causing the economy to be bland at the same time. And they realized, you're going to have a recession to do it. This is inevitable. Well, he says, do it. We get it out of the way quickly. So there was a brief recession early in the Reagan administration when they put through this thing, and then they squeezed that inflation out, and we've never bothered about it since. It can oscillate up and down into the below 10% range, below 5% range.
Whoa, pump your brakes, pump your brakes. Pump your brakes. We got somebody here that says they've debunked Aaron Ra, Apologia. It's a torture.
Gnostic
all
knowledge.
Of them. Yeah.
Oh, you've debunked all of these guys. Well, isn't that wonderful? Gnostic knowledge. Let me look to see if I've got them on my.
Can we
effing citation?
Can we get some citations, please? Because if you have debunked these guys,
but I don't care. Let me see if I've got him in my data field, because I still got my spreadsheet up, my secret decoder rings in here. Bing, 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 bing. No, I don't have him. Gnostic knowledge. So, bingo, bongo. How do you account for the reptile mammal transition? How do you account for and what version of Gnostic knowledge are you in supporting of? There. So good old Gnostic knowledge. Fire your best shot after the show is over. Put your claims down in the comment section there in the video, and we will inspect them and discuss them. Okay, here we go.
Oh,
So
Casey
anyway,
is here too. But yeah, so like that. But yeah, that was my whole thing for getting on, because I was like, it was just infuriating watching that Sunday, because I'm like, you're like, no, we can test for this, we will test for that, we can test for that. You're like, okay, let's set up a thing, and they're like, well, you're excluding all these variables. You're like, wait a second. So do you want to test for this variable to see whether it does a certain thing or not?
Every system needs to account for the data field. This is not only true of history. I don't have a science background per se. I have a BA in history, but it's exactly the same procedure. How do you know what happened in the past? Well, ultimately, you're drawing upon data points. And you have some that are physical things, like you have inscriptions on coins. You've got things that are written down. You've got monuments. You've got all sorts of stuff. But history is harder to do than science, because scientists don't have to worry about the rocks lying to them. They don't have to worry about the star faking it. No, all the data is direct. This individual scientist can be mendacious, but the data is the data, and anyone can theoretically look at it. Well, in history, we have to deal with the fact that you can put up propaganda, that a lot of Egyptian monuments are there to tell the official version of things. What actually went on? Who were the people that were in there? You can glean information from stuff, but unless, even with written documents, people can bullshit. And so that makes it much, much harder, but not impossible. And one of the ways that now modern forensics, if you compare 19th century science and archaeology with modern science and archaeology, you'll see a gigantic difference. To where in the old days you would go, oh, we found the dinosaur bone, let's take it out and cart it off to the museum and put it up. Now we want to know everything about the circumstance. The actual place the dinosaur died in is more interesting often than the dinosaur, because you can find out what was alive at the time. You can find out what other things were fossilized with it. You can find out the environment that it was put in. Was it a bit of piece or an entire animal? Was it in an estuary? Was it in a tidal zone? Was it in a desert? And now that is the same thing that happens in archaeology, because you can see,
because you know what?
You can see what dung was found in there. And all the bits and pieces illuminate the data point.
The thing what you said about seeing what was going on at the time and everything else that it's involved in that whole situation, right, is exactly what I cannot remember her name right now, but it's the Egyptologist that they have had quite a couple times on Non Sequitur show. That's what she says, because they're like, well, what about this stuff? At least this stuff, it makes, if it doesn't get found by you, it makes it into private collections and stuff. She's like, yeah, it's not just to have the mummy, it's to have this mummy and know that this mummy came from this place and was in this area and this is at what time this person died and when they were put in his grave and everything. And I'm like, oh shit, you can't find all that information out after the fact.
By the way, we can ask Gnostic knowledge, since he's talking about Pelagia. Pelagia's main thing is going after young earth creationists and answers in Genesis. So is Gnostic knowledge a defender of answers in Genesis?
I think he is, because what he said is he has screenshots and everything. He has a channel where after Aaron, Rob, Pelagia, and a lot fled, quote, like cowards that they are.
I will tell you this: young earth creationism is blatant pseudoscience, and it is physically impossible for you to make a solid argument that pays attention to all the data. And bring it on, kiddo, bring it on. And by the way, explain the reptile mammal transition data to us. Let's go on there. And if you believe in flood geology, please describe what the flood layer looks like where you live. There jolly well ain't a single flood layer here in Spokane, Washington. I know, I live on it.
And Brian Stevens said he's watching one of their videos right now, the dude's videos right now. It's, quote, full of shit, and it is, in his words, a fair review.
Ah, yes. Well, it's the coprolite version of apologetics. Yeah, you get an awful lot of those on there, and by all means, put up whatever check and you can send us some links and that on Twitter, and we can deal with it and maybe do it on a later evolution hour.
Oh,
I'll be on next week, but I'll probably not be on 2 weeks from now because that's the one right before Thanksgiving, and I'll probably be going over to some relatives, and that means I'll be out of town until the week after that. But that way I don't have to put stress on them to suddenly arrive on Thanksgiving Day. Who wants to drive during the traffic over the pass? So anyway, I probably won't have one on that Wednesday before then, the 22nd. Anyway, okay. So I guess we can pull us up on that. We found a new enemy in Gnostic knowledge. Oh, goody gumdrops. And so we can put that up. By all means, put up your best shots, discuss data, not arbitrary arguments, defend your source methods. We will ask Gnostic, does he source fact check anything that he reads, and how does he go about doing that? I will be fabulously surprised to see whether or not he ever does that kind of stuff, because an awful lot of apologists, C. Brown, who haunts my videos every once in a while, is one of these, that they're a repeater. They think copying the stuff from the creationist and regurgitating it back is argument. No, it's just copying. It's stenography. That's not thinking. And you need to deal with the data field. So
he only needs one source, though.
Well, creationists, to be fair, very rarely, they allude to the Bible, but they claim to be sciencey. Answers in Genesis is constantly citing technical literature. I keep track of it, remember? And so altogether, Andy, here's some little, we'll end on some interesting little quiz questions. I don't know whether I've asked you this before. Take a stab at how many technical papers anti-evolutionists have cited in their anti-evolution apologetics.
15.
Oh, no, it's way more than that.
200.
Way more than that. Oh, it's actually way more than that.
Oh, 1,000.
At the moment, I have about 4,000 technical papers that they've cited.
Wow.
Between intelligent design and young Earth creationism, most of them by young Earth creationism. Now, let's compare that to the data field. Do you know how many technical papers I have in my tip data field currently?
Probably about 250,000.
Well, no, I wish I had that much, but I do have about just a little over 25,000.
Okay, well,
and so their 4,000 are out of that. Now, here's the funner thing. I track some 2,400 anti-evolutionists, and guess what percentage of those don't even bother citing any primary source technical science?
Oh, probably 80%.
95%.
Okay, at least I was close.
So the vast majority of anti-evolutionists are secondary redactors who do not cite primary source material. Now, let's go to the fact claimants, the one who are actually citing the primary source technical literature. Guess how many of those there are?
Repeat?
How many fact claimants, the ones who are actually citing technical literature primary argument, how many of those are there in anti-evolutionism currently?
None.
No, there are. There are some. Remember, they're the ones that are citing the primary source technical papers. That 4,000.
Oh, I was gonna say that's probably like Nathaniel Jensen and
Dwayne Gish was one. Michael Behe's one over in Intelligent Design Land.
What's her name?
Engager. Georgia Purdom.
Georgia Purdom. That's her name. Yeah.
That bunch. They're all fact claimants. There are about 50 of them altogether.
But see, that's the thing, though. If there was any competition for a job at any university, Georgia Purdom could not muster up to get that job.
Yeah, Jackson Wheat and I are going after a lot of Purdom's arguments in the new Rocks Are There. That will be a plug. You'll want to get Evolution Slam Dunk, and then when we get The Rocks Are Still There out next year, you'll want to get that too, because we'll be doing for Answers in Genesis what I did solo on the reptile mammal transition, which is pull apart the whole shebang.
If you're digging on them folks from, if you're digging up knowledge on them folks from Answers in Genesis, I heard you say that that Ken Ham's a step above Kent Hovind. Well, because he employs, he kind of cites some technical data, but he employs people that actually do that kind of work.
You know how much money Ken Ham pulls down a year?
It's got to be in the millions.
His organization does, but his actual salary, the last I'd seen, was $150,000 a year and about $60,000 in perks. So
Well,
it's around 200,000 a year. I wish I could be as well funded as 1/10 of that.
what I was going to say is, I suggest you look at what happened, how he got the answers in Genesis started in America, and what he did to his brother-in-law
Oh, oh
in
yeah.
Australia.
It's the
He
reason
is
why
a
there's a Creation Ministries
cold-hearted dude.
International. They
He
had
is
a
a
big schism.
cold-hearted dude.
They had a big schism in the 1990s over the fact that he was running the show, and they didn't like the way he was running the show, and they had a big divide, and that's why they like Solomon separating the children in half. They took the various journals. So if you look today, some of the Answers in Genesis journal stuff is available only on CMI website, and some of it's only available at the AIG website because they parsed up which ones got which.
Is that Creation Ministries International, that one that's in the videos that Logic goes over, where he's like Dr. Ian Juby and stuff like that, like, and he's
CMI's gone off in its own direction. So all the non-American branch in the old,
and they're in Texas, right?
They became CMI and Creation Ministries International, and they're very busy little beavers. But all the archives of the old Answers in Genesis stuff, I think the Journal of Creation and a few of these other Creation magazine and stuff ended up over there. And of course, AIG has the Answers Research Journal now, which is their a premier technical thing. Do you know, amazingly, there's still more of their in-house technical journals than Intelligent Design. Intelligent Design has never mastered more than one at a time, and they always go defunct after a while.
How much? What I want to know is, how much are they invested in, or is it just they're wholeheartedly that video company that they keep repping? It's like a video company or a channel.
Well, I'm not familiar with that, but any creationist worth their salt is going to want to use all the current media, and so you see Eric Hovind doing a way more whiz-bang sophisticated job than Daddy ever did. Daddy's just got his damn cell phone out there and trotting out the PowerPoints for his little shtick, whereas Eric is doing a thing that looks like a regular show, and it's got green screen backgrounds and all that kind of stuff. It's much more sophisticated looking stuff. It's still claptrap.
It's called pureflix.com. And they've been doing a lot of, like, he's doing personal interviews with these people, and he's promoting their stuff a lot. And my question is, how much is he getting kickbacks? Like, he's a slimy dude, so I'm like, is it secretly his company?
I'm a charitable, kindly old man. I always assume that everybody believes exactly what they say. And
I'm from Las Vegas. I don't believe it.
Even if they're raking in money hand over fist, that makes it easier for them to do that, because now they feel validated by the Lord. I am not in principle willing to reject the idea that individual creationists are just in it for the money, but it's irrelevant to my methods approach, because it doesn't matter whether they're just in it for the money or craven liars or completely sincere. If they're incompetent methodologically, they should be opposed anyway, even if they are totally sincere. And so the methods approach bypasses the motivation angle.
I don't know, man. I think it's that Ken Ham, he's a slimy dude. I think it's like this: if Bodie quit the organization tomorrow, Ken Ham would sue him into poverty, man.
Oh, it's very possible. There would be a lot of
son-in-law. You know what I mean?
We in the same way that you find hissy fits that went on in creationism in earlier years, you had big doctrinal fuss-potting going on between young Earth creationists and non-young Earth creationists, and these are inevitable things. And the same thing when you the one thing that atheists and free thinkers need to be most careful about is picking their allies more efficiently, to where you've got branches of theistic evolutionists who you can find a lot of common ground with, unless you're making it a big deal that you got to give up God in order to believe in evolution, which is just not a valid argument. So the theistic evolutionist, meanwhile, is actually on a spectrum where all of the anti-evolutionists, including the intelligent design movement, are throwing bombs and turds at the theistic evolutionist all the time. So it would seem logical that we would want to find common cause with them in the course of defending science and sound method, and leave as some of the little side issues the point about whether or not what implications that has for religion thing. And that's why I am very much an accommodationist, to use that dreaded word that Jerry Coyne doesn't like, in a way that he is not. And I hope that we can have a better circumstance of it, because I don't know if you are aware of the fact that I'm the atheist blogger at the Spokane Faith and Values group locally. And I have a very nice reputation among them. Everybody knows I'm an atheist. I was the one that started up the atheist Ask an Atheist button. But they also respect me for the fact that I'm fair and rigorous, and I'm not an anti-theist per se, even though I make no bones about the fact that I don't think any of their theism is true.
Yeah,
so
I mean, you're not out proselytizing, but
no.
yeah,
Well, by nature, atheists don't usually proselytize. This, ironically, is a difficulty for us, because it means where the old cliche about it's like herding cats with atheists, it's literally true, and it's one I can see it in the difficulty I have in getting people to support the GoFundMe and all this stuff. Whereas the wingnuts in Trumplandia and Breitbart and all that bunch, they marshal their resources with blinding speed and cash at a rate that's just gobsmacking. So whatever it is that screws their brains up, it doesn't hurt their ability to coordinate socially. And that's one of the reasons why I think there's been a selection pressure for these sorts of things in cultural things. We know that I think it's called the dark triad of cognitive things, of narcissism and self-deception and other things that you think are bad things, but in fact they are also traits that really successful people tend to have. And so there's a certain degree to which business favors psychopathology, that you've got things that are bad but they are successful, and we tend to admire some of them. And we have a complete narcissistic ignoramus as president of the United States, and there you go.
Oh goodness! Yeah, it does make you value your ability to participate.
That's just a description.
Right, but it does make you value your ability to participate in democracy.
Yeah. Well, there we go. That's the circumstance of things that I, as an old fart who knows history, I lived through Nixon. I lived through a variety of people over the years. I was never as hypercritical as some people were. I never had a George Bush voodoo doll. I mean, the guy's a nice guy. He just got in with a bad crowd and he didn't read a lot. So I didn't vote for him, but he was a basically nice schlub. Even Nixon had some partially admirable characters. That's what makes him a tragic figure, Richard Nixon, because he was not a stupid man. He was a bright and often perceptive politician, but he had a vindictive streak, which was his undoing.
Yeah, he was a pretty nasty guy, dude.
Yeah, exactly. That was his undoing. And some of his policies were just claptrap. The wage and price controls I mentioned, and others that he wanted to show how compassionate he was. So ironically, all of the great society things that people complain about the Johnson administration, they're actually complaining about the Nixon administration, because the amount of great society things that were done in the Johnson years were relatively minor and low budget. It was Nixon that ratcheted everything up into a higher budget level. But I'm old enough to remember all of this stuff. I'm old enough to remember when the stock market was flirting with 700 points on the Dow, and
wow.
Oh yeah. That shows you that there was a guy that it was on the old market show that Louis Rukeyser had, and he's the Templeton Foundation guy. He's was very religious, Christian conservative, but also wanting ecumenical science and all this kind of stuff. And he's still got a big foundation that's long after he died. But anyway, he went on the Rukeyser show, and this would have been in the 70s, and he caused people to just roar with laughter when he announced that he thought the stock market would be above 6,000 before the turn of the 21st century. And they thought, what? Wow, that's just stupid. And then the big bull market occurred that started under Reagan and continued all the way through Bush and continued all the way into Clinton. And that's got the market up to where we've seen, where basically there were 4 doublings of the stock market during that period. And the same trajectory was occurring from the hole that happened after Bush 2. If you look at the Obama things, at the rate at which the market was climbing, again, it was the same trajectory that we had under the bull market. So we technically had a bull market, but it was digging us out of a really deep hole. So it didn't look like a bull market. And then as what happened in the Bush administration, when they put in their big tax cuts, I'm going, uh-oh, this is a problem. It's the wrong economic policy. It's not that tax cuts for some segments aren't good. It's the tax cuts on the people at the top.
Because they put their money away when they get tax cuts. They don't spend it.
Well, yeah. And you can make one of the mythologies of the Republican Party is that the only way you can make money in a market economy is by making new things. Well, that's one way. But you can also do it by buying out your competitor and throwing 20,000 people out of work. And so there's ways of doing that. Anyway, what happened in the Bush years is they brought the tax rate from 42% down to 39, the way it was, and then down to 37 in Trump. That obliterated the surpluses that we were getting under Clinton, and we went back to deficit spending, and the stock market stopped going up. It hit at about 13, 14, 15,000 and oscillated up and down like that all through his term until 2008 when it went bloop down into the hole. So when the Trump administration was coming in, I'm saying, don't keep talking about the stock market. You've just lowered the tax rate on people at the top. You're sucking money out of the market. That's going to stop the market going up. And it went up to 24, 25, 26, 24, 25, 26. It's doing exactly what happened in the Bush years. And that's without a trade war. Boy, wait till that starts hitting.
Because they said, that's what the tech manufacturer said, come January 1st, basically everything's going to go up a quarter per, anywhere between 14 to 25%.
Oh, since Mohawk is still, he was going to disappear, but apparently it isn't. Let me dump on Mohawk again. Mohawk, you're talking about your inner fish. Well, I suggest you read Neil Shubin's book on the subject. He's a paleontologist and worked with the developmental biology. And you want to account for the data in there, fine and dandy. You can also account for your inner reptile, and you can also account for your inner ape. We've got oodles and oodles of features going around as to why our pharyngeal arches are constructed the way they are, why our dentary bone is constructed the way it is, why our middle ears are constructed the way they are, why the genes that do them do the way they are. And I guarantee you, Mohawk, nobody on your creationist side can account for all of that data field. I dare you to try. There. So you got way overline on the show.
Yeah, I'll let you go, man.
We diverged into a lot of things. I'll tell you, it would be nice if you could insulate these issues from politics and all the rest. But the problem is you can't, and you never could. All of science and politics have always been knee-deep in one another. The reason why there was debate in certain circles over the new rock geology that was coming in the early 19th century as well. Oh, some of this geology is coming from those godless French over there with their revolution. That was literally some of the problems. Some of the genetic material and data that were being done, some of it was being done over in communist countries, or it was being the physics that was being done in Germany. Politics has always entered into these things. You can't disconnect the scientific pursuit from the places that do it. Do you know what's a weird thing in the current discussion between Saudi Arabia and Iran? And we know Saudi Arabia is about as democratic as a block of wood. And look at it, and neither is Iran. They've got a faux democracy. But do you know that they teach functionally flat earth geocentrism in Saudi Arabia schools? They teach regular evolution in Iranian schools.
Yeah, and that's insane to me.
Yeah, well, Iran, when the Shah was deposed, they never changed the educational system. They kept all the science. So the weirdness is you can find perfectly legitimate science work still being done in Iran, even as the stupid mullahs required the women to shroud themselves.
But it's kind of like that in Iraq. Is that they even when they took over, and it was like the Husseins that took over or whatever. When it came to that system, right? They took back over from the British. They kept the science and everything like that, and because my boss, he's Iraqi. He was a math teacher, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. There's a weird mixture of how cultures expropriate and fiddle example with science, or a perfectly fine examples for counterexample. I know we're running over and over and over our over and over and over, but it's an interesting subject. The Nazi educational system and the Soviet educational system. They all had their mythologies, and ultimately they cribbed themselves and hobbled themselves with it. The problem with the Soviet system is they had to have politically correct genetics, which meant that bourgeois genetics that said you couldn't have infinite plasticity and everything wasn't a blank slate had to be wrong. So they had Lysenkoism, and it screwed their agricultural system up and helped bring down the Soviet Union eventually. Over in Nazi land, their big bugbear, this won't come as a shock to you, was Jew physics. Ooh, Jew physics can't be right.
Oh,
and
wow.
So you had a bunch of anti-Semitic nincompoops.
But Jew labor can get them to the moon, right?
Yeah, and so our German scientists were better than the Russians' German scientists. And there too, politics went into. There were a lot of people who just looked the other way with Werner von Braun's Peenemünde work with the slave labor that went on in there, because we were so anxious to get our rocket to the moon, and he was appearing on Disney and all the rest. And so there's dark shadows to an awful lot of these things that nowadays
I'm saying
we don't
the
want to
Nazis, when they were building the rockets, they didn't want to use the Jewish mathematics, but they wanted to use the Jewish labor.
Yeah, it was a weird thing, and there's still a discussion to this day. My suspicion is that Werner Heisenberg dilly-dallied, that he deliberately screwed up stuff in the atomic program that the Germans had and managed to do it without getting shot. And he had communications back and forth. There were things where suddenly they made a big mistake and the stuff blew up. Yeah, I think he knew what he was doing on a lot of this stuff. So he was very circumspect, because he managed to slow them down, because they had so many advantages. They had all that damn heavy water that they were getting from the Norwegian hydroelectric things. It had one of the monopoly on the stuff. And of course, British came in and blew up some of that and sank the boats that were trying to ship it. Even the Japanese had a little itty bitty nuclear program that didn't really go a hell of a far ways, but they were trying to work on it. And the Germans were often their own worst enemies. When they came out with jets, idiot Goering wanted to use them only for bombers, when they should have been going for the fighter program. So the Messerschmitt fighter plane, which probably could have maybe tipped the war for them had they built them early enough, but fat Tuballard Goering was going for his bomber obsession. He thought he could bomb the British into submission. That didn't work. No, there was an awful lot of dumb. And when you have people who begin to believe their own propaganda, which happened in spades in the Hitler era, Hitler began to think he was the greatest genius ever, and he wasn't. And you could never tell him he was wrong. Well,
the drugs were sure not helping
as president, who you can't ever tell he's wrong. He's always got to be right on every mythology that he believes in, and that's not a good thing for a president to be, especially when we have enemies to contend with. Well, there's my little soapbox here, and by all means, Mohawk, try to account for the data. Give us your sources. Any source that you give, we're going to ask you how you fact check them, and account for the reptile mammal transition data that you'll have to research on, because you're not going to find much on it in the creationism literature. I know, because I surveyed all of them in Evolution Slam Dunk, which I hope you get your damn copy of today, so that you can all be up to speed. So thank you very much for a show that ran on way longer than planned and went on in a variety of areas. We'll be back next week, and thank you all for watching, and we are